Yes, thank you, Chris, and everyone for the opportunity to share my work. Since you mentioned this Hobbes paper is supposed to be one of the substantive chapter, the last one actually. The first and second one is Vittoria and Grotius. But at the same time, I'm aiming to develop into the independent paper. I'm actually quite in the early stage of studying Hobbes. So if you have any comment on, that I got wrong Hobbes, I would welcome, and I actually very appreciate that. So my paper examines Hobbes' contribution to and critique of the early modern development of international law. I place Hobbes' argument within the context of Francisco Vittoria and Hugo Grotius, who are often recognized as the fathers of modern international law. My focus leans more toward Grotius, examining the parallels and divergence between Grotius and Hobbes' view on indigenous rights and international law. My analysis reveals that while Hobbes does not entirely dismiss the legitimacy of Western imperial conquest, his critique of universal international law unveils the imperialist implication inherent in international law. Let me start with the historical context. The discovery of the Americas was a significant turning point for international law, as early international law discourses were profoundly shaped by the need to understand and define the rights of the Amerindians and their relationship to Christian Europeans. Confronting the New World, European scholars between 15th and 17th centuries were compelled to re-evaluate Western theology, philosophy, and history. In the discussion about the New World, the Amerindians' practice of cannibalism was central. Along with their apparent nomadic lifestyles and religious differences, this practice was deemed to be the hallmark of their supposed barbarism. The historical discourse on cannibalism in the New World began with Columbus. He reported discovering the island called Carib, where he encountered people perceived throughout the islands as fierce and who engaged in cannibalism. Subsequent explorers also reported a similar observation. This notion of cannibalism was later employed as a political justification for the conquest of the Americas. Emperor Charles V, for example, specifically commanded his soldiers to deter natives from practicing cannibalism and to teach them the principles of Christianity. The depiction of cannibalism played a significant role in European representation of the New World for a few important reasons. It served as a moral justification for the conquest and colonization of the Americas by Europeans. The framing of indigenous peoples as infidels and cannibals helped to construct a narrative that European intervention was necessary, not only for the exploitation of resources, but also for the moral and religious salvation of the native peoples. The narrative of cannibalism was so influential that it even found its way to the development of modern international law. Vittoria and Grotius highlight this as a central issue. While both thinkers rejected the doctrine of discovery, which justified the unconditional enslavement of non-Christians, they argued that cannibalism was an exception that allowed for European intervention under the law of nations. This law of nations, according to them, was binding even without the explicit consent of all nations. Vittoria wrote, for example, quote, "Even without the Pope's authority, the Spaniards have the right to prevent the barbarians from engaging in any reprehensible customary right." And by reprehensible customary right, he means cannibalism and human sacrifice. Grotius also claimed, quote, "War may be justly undertaken against those who eat human flesh," end of quote. Grotius in particular took a more radical view by asserting that the law of nations could be deduced from the consensus of the most civilized nations. He argued that the practice of cannibalism is placed in its practitioners below the rank of human, providing a pretext for Europeans to intervene in the indigenous societies. The emphasis on cannibalism thus became one of the tools for rationalizing European imperial expansion, allowing conquest under the guise of enforcing universal moral law. In this context, Hobbes entered the discourse on the New World. He does not directly mention cannibalism in his text, yet the frontispiece of the Kive reflects the contemporary perception of narratives about the cannibalism in the New World. This illustration is divided into two sections. The left side shows agriculture and civilized Europe, while the right side portrays savage images of natives hunting humans and partaking in cannibalism. Hobbes employs the period convention to differentiate the New World on the right and the Old World on the left, using the theme of cannibalism as a key element in this dichotomy. The frontispiece underscores how cannibalism was integral to the depiction of the New World and profoundly influenced the early modern Western political thought, particularly ideas about the state of nature and the social contract. This practice was often portrayed as hallmark of Amerindian supposed barbarism and their existence in a state of nature, highlighting the contrast with European civilization. Hobbes does not directly engage with Victoria or Grotius. He does criticize Suarez, who was profoundly influenced by Victoria as a part of his broader dismissal of scholasticism. He also interacts with the work of John Selden, who himself was in dialogue with Grotius. The aim of my paper is not to trace a direct line response from Hobbes to Victoria or Grotius, but rather frame Hobbes's criticism within the context of the law of nations, which Victoria and Grotius exemplified in their work with their focus on cannibalism. The existing literature has criticized Hobbes for his portrayal of native. The literature suggests he contributed to, quote, a sweeping philosophical devaluation of untamed American savagery, effectively, end of quote, effectively relegating Native Americans to the lowest rank of subhumanity. Hobbes's reference to the state of nature are thus interpreted as conceptual, symbolic, and political tool against Amerindian peoples. His claim on the natives has been contrasted to Victoria and Grotius, who are noted for their relative recognition of the sovereignty of non-European states and less Eurocentric approach. Hobbes is argued to have denied both the statehood and the sovereignty of indigenous societies, positioning them outside the civil political order that he imagined. While acknowledging the validity of some of these critics, I argue that Hobbes's work also contains surprisingly anti-imperialist implication, particularly in his critique of the law of nations. Hobbes's engagement with the subject of the New World is informed by his connection to the Virginia Company, which came through his association with a Cavendish family. He was present at important meetings and took part in various affairs of the company. Additionally, as I previously mentioned, he also interacted with Selden, a jurist also involved in the company. Throughout his works, Hobbes mentions the Amerindians around 9 times, primarily to explain the state of nature. A notable reference on indigenous rights appears in the dedicatory epistles of Dekibe. Here, following Selden, Hobbes states, quote, it was clear that he means private ownership, did not originate in nature, but in human agreement. For human beings have distributed what nature had placed in common, end of quote. And this is very closely related to the terra nullius that you have just mentioned. He suggests that while individuals in the state of nature may have liberty, they lack right to ownership. This argument is once again visually represented in the contrasting imagery of the frontispiece, which contrast the orderly agricultural landscapes of Europe with the sporadic cultivation, hunting practices, and perceived savagery in the Americas. Hobbes's depiction of the New World categorizes the indigenous people of the Americas as savages living in the state of nature. By positing that private ownership emerges from human agreement, Hobbes implies that in the absence of such agreement, no individual has legitimate claim to anything. This perspective can be interpreted as a denial of native people's claim to their lands and as providing a philosophical justification for European disposition of these lands under the premise that indigenous peoples had not entered to the necessary agreements to legitimize their ownership. Hobbes's view, however, does not fundamentally depart from Grotius in this regard. Grotius aligns closely with Hobbes in suggesting that ownership is derived from positive law, and thus some indigenous people may lack these rights. The literature on Hobbes indicates that Hobbes also did not include civilizations such as Incas and Mayas in his depiction of state of nature, which aligns him very closely with Grotius. My view is that the idea Hobbes assigns a lower status to natives arise because he does not consider religion as, especially infidelity, as a potential impediment to ownership, unlike Victoria and Grotius. The real difference between Hobbes and Grotius lies in Hobbes' emphasis on the sovereign's authority. Hobbes takes a distinct position by challenging interpretation and implementation of unwritten laws. He argues that law of nature, which is to seek preservation and peace, is seemingly unclear to those who use their reason without bias. However, it becomes obscure due to self-love and passion. In Hobbes' view, the law of nature requires authoritative interpretation, and this authority rests with the sovereign. He asserts that the interpretation of law of nature does not depend on philosopher, but on sovereign power. He writes, quote, "The interpretation of law of nature in a commonwealth depend not on the book of moral philosophy. It is by sovereign power that it is law. Otherwise, it were a great error to call the law of nature unwritten law," end of quote. Hobbes does not deny the existence of natural law in the absence of a sovereign, nor does it suggest that it is irrelevant in international relations. Instead, he emphasizes the challenges of implementing natural law without a sovereign to define and enforce it. For Hobbes, the fundamental goal of natural law is to secure peace, and as the most basic human condition is to remain alive, and peace is the state in which this basic condition can be fulfilled. He outlines a set of rules designed for the pursuit and maintenance of peace. These rules are not subjective and not at the discretion of sovereign. However, the difficulty lies in the enforcement in the absence of a common power. What Hobbes rejects is the idea that natural law or the law of nations should be based on consensus among civilized nations or the opinions of the wise. He points out the subjective nature of such judgments, noting there's no universal agreement on who qualifies as the most civilized or the wisest. In chapter 15 of Elements of Laws, he writes, quote, "For the most part, such writers as have occasion to affirm that anything is against the law of nature to allege no more than this, that it is against the consent of all nations or the wisest and most civilized nations. But it is not agreed upon who shall judge this nation are the wisest." This assertion resonates with Hobbes' claim in Leviathan chapter 13 that individuals in the state of nature are equal because everyone considers themselves to be wise. This stance directly challenges Grotius' argument that the law of nations is determined by the consensus among scholars and civilized nations. Hobbes' rejection of the idea that a consensus among European nations, civilized nations, should form the basis of international law significantly influences his argument regarding the practices like cannibalism. Grotius sees those who engage in cannibalism to be below the level of humanity. He further argues that individuals in the international domain have the right to punish such transgressions, provided the punisher is not guilty of the same. This implies that Europeans who do not practice cannibalism have the right to punish Amerindians even outside European jurisdiction. Hobbes' position is markedly different. He identifies a tension between natural rights and natural law. In Hobbes' framework, natural right is the freedom of each person to use power for self-preservation, which could include any necessary means, implicitly suggesting that practices like cannibalism could be seen as a means of self-preservation. While such actions might contravene the natural law, which dictates that individuals should lay down their rights to all things in pursuit of peace, Hobbes does not morally condemn those who practice cannibalism in the state of nature. This is a departure from Grotius' view that moral law exists independently of a central authority and carries with it right to punish. Hobbes, on the other hand, suggests that in the absence of a common power, imposition of punishment is not justified. Hobbes' stance does not necessarily invalidate Western imperial expansion. He posits that the growing number of poor necessitate the relocation to sparsely populated territories. In this view, this expansion is not about the extermination of existing population, but rather about encouraging more efficient cultivation of land. Additionally, Hobbes claims that due to the planet's finite capacity, war naturally emerges as a grim solution for population growth. Thus, Hobbes view Western colonization of the New World as an inevitable consequence of population pressures and pursuit of resources. Another relevant argument is Hobbes' perspective on slavery. In chapter 8 of the Kive, he explains the origin of slavery through the right of conquest. According to this principle, a right of dominion is established at the end of war. This occurs when the defeated party negotiates with their life by promising to serve the victor indefinitely, agreeing to, quote, do all he shall command, end of quote, in exchange of mercy. As a result, the conqueror acquires a right of dominion, while the conquered gains a sparing of their life. This viewpoint is not very different from those of Victoria and Grotius regarding slavery. What I want to emphasize here is that Hobbes is far from the defender of natives. In conclusion, I would like to invoke Article 38 of the Statute of International Court of Justice to show the relevance of Hobbes' argument. This article is considered as most authoritative international law, and it states that the court's ruling should rely on international convention, custom, and notably, quote, the general principles of law recognized by civilized nations, end of quote. This echoes the Grotian tradition of international law, which Hobbes fundamentally contested. Hobbes depicted the New World in line with the cannibalistic narrative of his era and did not outright condemn European imperialism. However, his criticism of universally binding international law highlights its implicit imperialistic bias. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome any thoughts and questions.
Lucia.
Just a really quick question about the front. So it seems like, maybe I'm wrong in listening, but it seems like your main evidence for the cannibal part of Hobbes, maybe it doesn't actually mention it, is the frontispiece.
Yes.
So it just I guess a suggestion would be like to really drive that home, maybe giving some details on like. So we know that Hobbes definitely had a big hand in designing the Thucydides frontispiece and the Leviathan frontispiece, but we also know the Dicaedo was rushed for political reasons. So how much of a hand did you have in designing that? And the frontispiece also changes, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, is that particular image Hobbes is my question.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, definitely. I'll need to do more with the explanation, but for now, all I can say is actually, if I brought the presentation, I should be able to show the drawings at the same time. And actually, in many cases, in the world map, this new world was depicted as a place of cannibalism and sometimes even human sacrifice.
But is it, so is it, you know what I mean? So yes, of course, it's in the imagination of the time.
Yeah. But I get it.
Maybe I was going to answer a similar question actually. I was like, I'm drawing up the picture. But my eyes are going back. Okay, so a very broad question. So in the way that you're tracing this sort of history of contemporary international law, you're sort of doing a genealogy back to Vittorius, Grotius, and Hobbes, right? And so my question is part of your claim then, just a very broad claim, like that the rise of international law is necessitated by colonialism and imperialism. In other words, prior to that, you have within Europe, you don't have the Westphalian state. You don't have the kind of need for that, right? Because you sort of have a Hobbesian world anyway. So there's not that real. You have one-off relations, right, and treaties and so on, but you don't have that need. And so international law as a concept arrives with colonialism. Is there something like that, or
yes? Basically, yes. The concept of law mentioned actually goes back to the Roman Empire, and I think for the similar reason. But although this figure actually heavily relying on Roman tradition, but what I'm trying to say is there is like a new need to formulate international law of nations because of the discovery of the New World, and so another argument is that there's like a breaking point between the doctrine of discovery and distinctors. So in the doctrine of discovery, basically divided land for Portuguese, Spanish Empire, and legitimizing unconditional conquest of enslavement of the native people and indigenous people. But Victoria and Grotius specifically, they're coming out with more nuanced arguments that sort of defend their rights. But what I'm trying to say is there's like a nuanced imperial bias in their arguments. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I was really interested in this idea of how you were saying the law of nations isn't based on consensus, isn't necessary in international law. And I was actually just wondering what that might entail for Hobbes's contractarian theory, and whether there's a tension in his ideas of free consent given versus this imposed consent. And whether that might be some sort of friction in his own theory.
Could you explain a bit more? So what's the relation between law of nations and Hobbes' account on consent?
Yes, so and I might have interpreted this wrong, but you mentioned that in international law, Hobbes holds that consent of all the parties, i.e. all the nations, isn't necessary for a social contract amongst nations to be generated. So I was just wondering if that's different than his idea of a social contract as it would arise in like a nation from the state of nature, and why these versions of consent, the necessary consent of all parties in the original social contract versus the consent of only some like parties, I would say,
Yes.
in the international scheme,
Yes.
and why there would be that sort of difference.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think I have to think more about the topic. But I'm not even I'm not sure Hobbes' account of social contract in domestic politics necessarily involve consent in the first place. Yeah, like yes, that's one point. Because I think part of his argument is that every rational I'll go this one. But anyway, there's one point, and the second is but what I'm trying to argue here is like separate from that, saying that what he's saying, what he's criticizing is like this law of nation thinkers, especially Grotius, are formulating this concept of international law, and they are aware of the limitations, right? It is the difficulty of coming out of universal consent that was agreed by all nations. So what they're doing is the way to achieve that, it becomes some principle becomes a law of nation or international in modern terms by the principle that is agreed by the civilized nations, right? So that is what he's saying, and he's criticizing that by saying that what is really civilized nation. So even European nation coming out with certain principles that are agreed upon in the civilized nations, but the notion of civilized and wise itself is subjective. So even if they have actual consent, that cannot be applied universally. So yeah, that's more the argument that I'm making. I hope that answers your question.
All right, so you contrasted, I think rightly, Grotius's more old-fashioned natural law view that moral considerations apply even in the absence of a political authority that can enforce them. And then you made the point also, I think rightly, that Hobbes thinks that punishment of the Amerindians for cannibalism is unjustified. My question is, what does unjustified mean in that context? Because unjustified seems like, it seems like a moral concept in the absence of a political authority that is common between those two communities. So can you just say a bit about what justification would mean in that context?
So yes, we have to rethink about the term because justice for Hobbes and punishment is only exists within the sovereign law. So yes, I have to rethink about that term. I think you rightly pointed out. But what I wanted to contrast for punishment, for Grotius, punishment and justice exists beyond the sovereign. So he's notably making the argument that even individuals have this sovereign authority to make punishment in international law by the natural law. So he's making this connection even without jurisdiction, even beyond the jurisdiction, individuals can justly punish individuals. But Hobbes is making the opposite argument because such notion only exists within the sovereign. So yes, I think you're right that I have to rethink about that term. Yes.
Alicia.
So I was wondering, you seem to stay mainly in Duquesne with Hobbes, and I guess I was wondering why you do that. I mean, you talked about elements as well, but you didn't really talk about Leviathan as much. And his account of slavery and Leviathan is a bit different than it is in Duquesne, because he makes a really strange argument there that basically, like, slavery is a continued law, or a state of war until the master basically trusts the slave with their corporeal liberty.
Yeah.
So that there's no obligation to obey or not to.
I see,
Kill the
yeah,
master or
Yeah.
to run away.
yes, I think I don't have a good answer to that question, Puna, but I think I definitely have to think about that, yes, thank you.
Oh, I was just gonna follow up on the question, which is it's maybe a justification, it's without justification, right? So in other words, he's just simply saying, they're justifying this in terms of a natural law, but there's no justification, right? Which means they're in a state of nature, where everybody's returning. So it means he's actually being fastidious with this notion that between any nations, right, or the nation and some exterior, we're back to the state of nature, right? Which Locke held to as well, right? So we don't have, there's no notion of international law. Now, once you get contract theory, you only have those you only have imminence, you don't have any transcendent, which would just require another contract, which we don't have, right? And so that became the dream of 400 years and it's still a failure, but some ways, right? And so, yeah, so it's, I like that quite a bit for thinking through those issues, because it's, well, it's horrific. And I thought there'd be much more in capitalism, but it's great. But no, it's fantastic.
Yeah, that really helpful, no justification, yeah.
I've got a question. Sorry, get my nose again. I've got a question. It's not right at the heart of what you were saying, so it may be a point that others might want to chip in on as well. But I'm thinking of cannibalism and the role that it's playing in these arguments, and the way that it's just reflexively immediately coded as negative. And like one response would be, well, yeah, but Montaigne.
Give me a second here.
No. But Montaigne and of Cannibals, which precedes all of this, is like, you know, he's not saying cannibalism's great, but he's really different to all of this, and the way in which he tries to, you know, think his way into this other way of being and relate to it, it seems to either have been lost or dismissed or not read. And so I guess my question is something like, why do you think, or why do we think that cannibalism is so negatively coded? Is it instrumental in that we need something to be able to say, we've got to go in there and sort these people out? Let's have cannibalism. That's an easy win. No one's going to argue with us.
Yeah.
Or are there other things going on in the coding of cannibalism here? And does Montaigne figure anywhere in any of this? And is anyone actively refuting him, or is he just like, is there radio silence about Montaigne?
So yeah, as far as I know, there is no evidence that Hobbes read Montaigne cannibalism, but I see he's making a pretty similar argument. But I would say Montaigne and Hobbes in this case are more exceptions. If you see, so there's like a whole claim that this Americans are actually the descendants of Scythians, which are defined as cannibals, and the discourse in the cannibals actually goes back to Neolithic and even the ancient. In defining feature of the barbarism of, you know, not just the American Indians. So and it was closely associated with the decision as a civilized and barbarian. So it just, I mean, it was an interesting fact is so this discourse got so famous that even the British used this discourse in describing the Irish that they're cannibals. So it was a very political mode. I mean, there was a studies a few back then until there was the archaeological evidence that this actually a fabricated story, but the archaeological evidence actually showed that there's evidence that Spaniards were actually eaten by the native people. But anyway, the point I was trying to make is there's a long history for this. And the thinkers and the pointing out to that specific element, which distinguished them as a savage who needs salvation and intervention.
I mean, I was just thinking like one in the history of philosophy, when Germans and Italians are about writing the histories of philosophy, which is required for the 18th century when the universities, they were literally coming up with syllabi and they were putting together. One of the interesting things, philosophy for Africans and Indians and the Chinese come back and forth over the issue of cannibalism.
Yeah.
Like it's like so zombies can't be cannibals, is something like the argument. Like it's weird like how it just is so sticky.
Yeah.
It's like, no, they can't be philosophical. They have thoughts, but they can't be because they're reading other people.
Yeah.
Right. It's a weird, like it does remain pretty sticky. It's a
Yeah. I mean, related to that is when Columbus first found America, they thought it was China, in India, right? And I think the depiction of cannibalism actually related to that, this tartars or deers and
That's right, yeah.
Flesh, yes.
I have a question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, just on that topic of the sort of cannibalism, it's interesting that what sort of the illusion was is that there is this idea that this is sort of an inherent wrong that needs correction, but if there can be no justice or good or bad within the state of nature, on what grounds do they say we need to go in there and correct this wrongdoing if in that state there is no right wrong? That's just one question.
Yeah, so actually, Victoria makes a very interesting argument because, I mean, I think there's a reason why he's called the father of international law, and he defended the rights of Native Americans. There's a whole theological and church context in his argument. They thought the Native Americans are potential to be the true Christians, and they wanted he defended the rights. And I mean, I think it's quite surprising that he just rejected the doctrine of discovery that even non-Christians possess the right. And the cannibalism claim comes very interesting in that sense. Slightly more on Victoria, he opposed the idea that the Christian has the right to punish as opposed to Grotius, because that's just doesn't make sense for many reasons. But he brings the cannibalism sort of the humanitarian, making the sort of humanitarian argument that we need to save the innocent being eaten and harmed by the cannibals, right? So there's a different nuances in different for the different thinkers. For Grotius, he was more fully defending the right to punish, but Victoria was making more subtle arguments saying that it's not really a punishment, but it's actually an intervention to help the people. We do the conquest to help the people. So I hope that answers the question. But there are many nuances, but the common thing is this cannibalism and human sacrifice constantly coming out as an important justification.
I guess I just have like a general question, maybe to everybody, or unless you have thoughts about this. What is it now that cannibalism is opened up as like a much larger trend? It seems there's so many examples. What is it? What are the philosophical assumptions that ground the determination that cannibalism defines people who do it as bad or evil or whatever we would want? I mean, there'd be a whole range of the names that they would be called, but one of the defining features is you're not part of civilization anymore. You're like in the state of nature. What's the assumption behind cannibalism?
Yeah, I don't think I have a good.
And how do you see them?
Outside the fact that I think it's intuitive and maybe obvious. I don't think it's a good answer, but yeah. That's all I'm studying is actually there was a history to that, but why normally question, I think you're asking normally question of why that's specifically specified as acts that put people below the human rank. I don't think I have a good answer to that yet. Yeah.
So I've got a speculative answer to Thomas's question that I think is at least plausible. Within the sort of modern tradition, the relation that governs human beings are relations of right. And it's hard to think of anything more prima facie contrary to the relation of right than cannibalism. So if we take Kant's example of lack of relation of right as treating someone like a thing, this is worse than treating someone like a thing. I'm using the person as a means, but I'm literally incorporating the person, right? So it seems if you have like an archetype of something that would be contrary to the relation of right, it seems like that's what it would be.
Although you're incorporating the body, not the person, right? Are there distinctions between the dead, like I'm eating the dead?
Oh, actually, I have one interesting answer.
Okay, and then we're going to
Yeah,
get to it.
Sorry, I didn't see.
So for Victoria, he makes a strange argument that cannibalism actually causes problems at resurrection. Yes,
That does make
because
sense. That makes perfect sense.
because he argued that it doesn't make sense that Christians have right to punish. for the students of the infidelites, right? But cannibalism is different. Why? Because it's so there. I guess the point here is there's a tension. So if you especially in the Victoria case, you do not want to justify the punishment beyond the jurisdiction, but at the same time you want to justify the punishment or intervention for the cannibalism. So he makes this sort of weird argument.
Policy.
Yeah, so in Herodotus, when it's discussed in Herodotus that the sort of mad king, this Cambyses, the sort of evidence of him being mad was that he didn't respect that, sort of how people treat their dead in different places. And so there's this episode where he kind of goes to the Greeks and says, how much would, you take money for we ate your dead instead of burying them. And he said no amount of money. And then they go to the Indians and say, how much will you, the coalitions, how much would you pay us if we bury your dead to eat them? You can't pay us enough money. And so but there it's described as the honoring of the dead, not the use, not the instrumentalization or the thing, me treating something as a mere need. In Montaigne, by contrast, it is an act of domination, I mean, it's a very sophisticated act of domination. But
I guess the broader response is thinking about Thomas' point. Maybe it is more difficult to even for these thinkers to actually distinguish it from other sort of points.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's different explanations. Like your explanation might work for the moderns, but it wouldn't work for the ancients. And even maybe there'd be different ancient cultures in which, but it seems like I guess the question, I mean, I don't have an answer, but I wonder if there's some larger thing that is shared, or is there, or they're just totally different justifications, or what is the deepest justification shared by many ancient cultures and modern ones? And I don't know the answer, but it would take a lot of work on cannibalism to figure, like, you'd want to look at all the case studies of cannibalism and see why, and maybe the worries about the soul might come in, worries about honoring the dead, regardless of Christian souls at all. Like,
It's in the short list of the taboos, right? Incest, cannibalism.
yeah,
It's supposedly, universal.
yeah, but that's the thing, supposedly.
Supposedly,
That it's not universal, and but the nearness of it makes it interesting.
Okay, we're going to have one more intervention from Brian, and then we're going to draw this session to a close.
So maybe what I'm going to say is going to synthesize some points, but there's a Hegelian point that might be relevant here, that what spiritualizes the human form, what makes the human form something other than a thing, is the way we deal with the dead. And it certainly, this isn't a mandatory view, but it's not a hard view to understand that one way of treating the human form as something more than mere nature is to not consume it, right? So yes, the person is already dead, and we might think, well, therefore we're not violating their right, but it seems at the basis of the notion of right is this sense that humans are in some way distinct from nature, and it's practices involving the dead that sort of sustain that view.
Wonderful, thank you. This has been a particularly rich discussion time, I think, and we have Joorahm to thank for feeding that with a wonderful paper. So, Joe, please join me in thanking Joorahm.